Hey everyone, welcome in. Now that I'm over 1,400 hours of game time into Diablo 4, I want to tell you about some of the biggest problems facing the game. And for those of you about to fill up my comments and question my actual game time, here's a full breakdown of where all of that time comes from. I think Diablo 4 is a great game with a long life ahead of it, but there are some major problems holding it back. These include crowd control, vulnerable damage, lack of dungeon variety, and no endgame to really speak of. There are perhaps 100 other problems on my shortlist, and I could make this video 6 hours long talking about all of them, but let's keep it focused on these 4 items. But before that, let me focus on this segue to my sponsor. This video is brought to you by Signal RGB, Skytech Gaming, and Intel. They've joined forces to bring you this Diablo 4 PC. The hand-painted treasure chest chassis is complete with in-game reactive health and mana potions. This is made possible by the Signal RGB app, which syncs with RGB devices from any brand to bring you a cohesive lighting experience. It also comes complete with the 13th gen Intel 13600K and an RTX 4070. The 3D printed case is custom designed by the Skytech team with performance and cooling in mind, equipping you with the best hardware for taking on Sanctuary's mightiest foes. Click the link in the description below to find out how you can enter the giveaway. The absolute worst problem in the game right now is crowd control. This is when your character gets stunned, dazed, slowed, chilled, frozen, feared, knocked down, knocked back, or anytime you lose control of your character. In general, losing control isn't fun. It's not a fun thing for anyone to experience. In most games, it's intended as a punishing mechanic when you've messed up as a player. You forgot to dodge the big attack, or the damage circle on the ground. But what's so wild about Diablo 4's crowd control is that it's unavoidable by design, forcing you into situations where you lose control of your character no matter what you do. Even at World Tier 1, the easiest difficulty in the game, getting frozen is immensely punishing. It's not uncommon for one effect to make you lose control of your character for 3 or more seconds. Even worse, enemies can layer these crowd control effects on you to keep you stunned for an extremely long period of time. And because there's no diminishing returns in the crowd control that's applied to your character, enemies can keep you permanently stunned forever until you die. That's neither fun or challenging for the player. In fact, other major games with pervasive stun mechanics are reworking their crowd control entirely. Dota 2, for example, in their last major update, New Frontiers, cut many stun durations by 20 to 50%. And this is a game, by the way, where the longest, most punishing stuns are only 3 seconds long and typically come with a major cooldown attached to them. A good example of this is Magnus's reverse polarity skill. It has a 120-second cooldown and only does a 3.5 second stun. Now, why is this relevant to Diablo? That's a totally different game, right? Well, because losing control of your character is the most dangerous and least fun situation in the entire game right now. You can't fight back to try to outdamage the enemy. You can't use your defensive skills to try to out-tank the enemy. You can't dodge, you can't run away, or you can't outskill the enemy at all. In fact, you're not even playing the game. In Diablo 4, enemies can frequently spam their crowd control abilities with little or no cooldown, and they can frequently stun, freeze, daze, or immobilize you for 3 or more seconds, and they can do that for every new group of monsters that you encounter. Some enemies like snakes don't even have to be elites to stun. Even a basic run-of-the-mill snake can stun you in a mostly undodgeable way. Basic spiders can freeze you at range by attacking you with ranged webs from completely off screen. Cannibals can turn around and stun you instantly with no turning radius at all. Bloated zombies can knock you back with their on-death effect, and those aren't even the worst ones. The worst crowd control in the game is when a fast monster, like a spider or one of these little vampire guys, has Cold Enchanted. Each normal hit that they do will basically instantly freeze you with no way to escape. Even if you use an unstoppable skill, that crowd control effect is up 100% of the time, and the instant that your unstoppable effect ends, you get frozen again. Your choices against these enemies as a player are as follows. 1. Instantly kill the enemy before they can reach you. 2. Have your build include 100% uptime on an unstoppable effect. Or 3. Use an unstoppable skill and instantly kill the enemy in the short duration that you have available. In some ways, there's even one more category of crowd control that's actually worse than even this: environmental effects. These include the little traps on the ground, barrels that explode, falling rocks that can knock your character down, or invincible spellcasting effects that stay even when the enemy is killed and defeated, like these frozen shard things from goatmen shamans or the webs from spiders. In most cases, these are effects that are undodgeable, unkillable, and give the player no way to overcome them except either get lucky and miss their hitbox when running around, or have 100% uptime on unstoppable effects even outside of combat. I should mention that even builds that are quote-unquote 100% uptime on unstoppable effects actually don't usually have 100% uptime, but rather a mechanic that as long as you cast the buff, you have uptime on unstoppable. That means that the player is actually more in the 95 or higher uptime category percentage in practice, and even builds that optimize for unstoppable frequently will still get hit with crowd control effects, causing this sort of stutter or interruption of gameplay. In a way, it makes you as a player have to tiptoe around encounters that aren't really dangerous at all, except for the fact that that enemy has cold enchanted. The game developers have clearly tried to help players solve the problem of crowd control by giving each class unstoppable skills and effects. In fact, we've also recently discovered a priority enhancement system that makes reduced crowd control duration a priority reroll stat on chest armor as well. And while these ways of helping the player solve the problem is appreciated, the net result is that every single player is forced into a 100% uptime unstoppable build, or forced to sacrifice survivability to deal with the mechanic that's simply eroding control of their character. Not only that, but some classes can't even maintain 100% uptime on unstoppable, or do so with mechanics that are very brittle and likely to get nerfed in the future. This can very quickly lead to a situation where a class simply doesn't have any good builds available anymore, and it doesn't matter how much damage you do or how much damage reduction you have if the enemy is simply able to chain stun you forever. I think trying to present crowd control as a problem for players to solve with unstoppable is just straight up bad design. It forces every single build for every single class to play a single way. And the end result of that is just being able to control your character. Unlike trying to solve the problems of doing lots of damage and having lots of damage reduction or having lots of available resource, solving the problem of crowd control with unstoppable mechanics is an unsatisfying exercise in frustration. Crowd control should really only be used to punish a player for ignoring a major threat from an enemy that's telegraphed very clearly, and it should also be something that the game doesn't do very often, perhaps only on boss fights or certain very select elite monsters that have a rare affix that allow them to do crowd control. And even then, the crowd control effect should be on a long enough cooldown so that players can plan ahead and anticipate the attack, and then be of short enough duration so that then players can continue to actually play the game even if they do get punished. I think crowd control is the #1 most serious problem facing the game right now, so I've come up with a list of suggestions to fix it. I'd advise Blizzard to look at some of the following ways of fixing this. #1, change the design approach of crowd control entirely. It isn't a problem to be solved by Unstoppable. It should be a way to change players' approach to rare encounters. It should be reserved for elite affixes that are easily identifiable or for bosses. Normal monsters should almost never have crowd control, especially hard crowd control, and if they do, it should not be a hurdle to gameplay. #2, take all of the existing durations on crowd control in the game and cut them in half. Reduce it all by 50%. This is the new starting point of the nerfs needed to bring crowd control even into the realm of reality. This is the start. Number 3, implement diminishing returns for crowd control for players. A player should automatically gain unstoppable and become immune to crowd control effects at a certain point to avoid strange, long scenarios where you get chain CC'd forever. Number 4, give players additional defensive tools to ignore crowd control beyond just unstoppable and give them more reasons to use fortify and shield mechanics. For example, fortified should allow you to ignore stun, dazed, and slow effects entirely, and any amount of fortify beyond 100% should allow a relative reduction in the duration of slow, dazed, and stunned. Shield should similarly allow you to ignore fear, freeze, and chill while at full shield levels, and allow a reduction in the duration for those effects below full shield amounts. Number 5, remove crowd control from environmental effects entirely. Falling rocks, little traps on the ground, barrels, and more are almost unavoidable in many gameplay situations, and even if they were, they present no XP gain or actual challenge for the player to overcome. These effects also disproportionately affect controller players, since you can't typically move your character with pixel-perfect accuracy to skirt around these hitboxes. Number 6, either dramatically nerf or remove hard crowd control effects like stun and freeze from normal monsters. Whereas a baseline nerf of 50% is needed across the entire game on all crowd control durations to even start the conversation, regular monsters should either have their crowd control effects reduced by 90% or eliminated entirely. The overall effect, like snakes, as mentioned earlier, is that it bricks the entire monster family, and it makes them unfun to engage with for the player. It also takes away the design space for this for elites and bosses. Number 7, force monsters who do crowd control effects in a large group to trigger a cooldown of other nearby monsters' crowd control effects. Enemies should not simply be able to dump 10 crowd control effects on you because there are many of them. One freeze is still far more dangerous when attacking 10 monsters than one monster, because while you're frozen, the 10 monsters can simultaneously all damage you. Number 8, the darkness or smoke effect crowd control effect has major problems. Not only does it disable all of your abilities, but it also disables unstoppable and other escapes too, even if they're active on your skill bar. This particular crowd control effect, in my opinion, needs its own special nerf. Not only should most of these have a smaller radius, but instead of completely making your character useless, it should give your skills maybe a 50% miss chance. The problem here is that this crowd control effect removes control of my character entirely, regardless of my power level, build, skill, or whatever else I have equipped on my character. And because this effect exists as a Nightmare Dungeon affix through Drifting Shade, and on some regular monsters like bandits or frequently encountered bosses like Kixarth and Helltides, it's not something the player can really just avoid thoroughly with good gameplay either. Number 9, finally, let's talk about cold enchanted elites. They need to have a dramatic change in behavior. Their attacks apply too much chill, which becomes an instant freeze. They have the chill and freeze attacks available at all times with no cooldown, and they can sometimes even do a massive AoE chill attack which covers half the screen when they attack anything, including minions or other players. They need a cooldown on their cold enchanted effect, their attacks need to have only limited uptime, and their AoE freezing attacks need to be removed or slightly nerfed. I hope that some of these fixes make it into the game soon, because I think it severely limits players in making interesting builds, because you always have to design your build around a 100% uptime unstoppable. It offers the player no options aside from the one build that actually allows them to play the game. Alright, let's move on to the second major problem with Diablo 4, vulnerable damage. Vulnerable damage is a hard requirement for every good build in the game right now due to the way that it gets calculated in the damage equation. Normally, applying vulnerable gives you a 20% damage bonus from all sources, but you can increase this bonus with vulnerable damage bonuses from gear, passives, or the Paragon board. These bonuses are added together before it gets multiplied into the rest of the damage equation, which makes vulnerable affixes tremendously more valuable than anything besides separate multipliers on your gears, such as the ones you gain from legendary aspects. In fact, applying vulnerable and vulnerable damage is so important that if your build doesn't do it, you can pretty much guarantee that it's a bad build that does pitiful damage. This, of course, has an extremely limiting effect on build diversity. Let's take a deeper look at Necromancer, for example. There are exactly 5 ways that you can apply vulnerable on a Necromancer. Number 1, hit them with the splintering aspect with Bone Spear. Number 2, apply Corpse Tendrils with the vulnerable upgrade. Number 3, use Sever, and on the 4th strike, you can get vulnerable with the vulnerable upgrade. Number 4, trap them inside a bone prison with the vulnerable upgrade. Or number 5, get lucky with a very small chance to apply vulnerable on bone splinters. Practically speaking, the only good vulnerable applications here are splintering and corpse tendrils, and that means that every single Necromancer build better include one or both of these skills or be regulated to the lower tiers of gameplay. So even though lots of folks are saying Necromancer is quite strong right now, it's only because splintering itself on Bone Spear is strong, and a very small nerf to even this one aspect would likely brick the build and the entire class and send many players just flocking to other classes who can apply vulnerable more easily. I think the solution here is actually to change the way vulnerable affixes get added together in the damage equation. Instead of adding them all together to the 20% base vulnerable damage increase, they should get multiplied together just like any other stat. This would allow them to be balanced in a similar fashion to other damage affixes like damage to close or damage to fortified, for example, instead of being a ridiculous outlier that constrains build diversity. Nerfing vulnerable affixes also has the knock-on effect of making other affixes relatively more important. For example, if your build allows you to stay fortified with 100% uptime, like Druid might allow you to do, then the increased range of damaged while fortified might be more attractive of an affix to you than vulnerable damage. It also has the important effect of allowing the game to be more easily comprehended for newer players or players who don't treat Diablo 4 damage equations like a college-level linear algebra class. This increased approachability to the game, I think, will be extremely important as more and more things get added going forward. All right, let's hit the third major problem of Diablo 4, lack of dungeon variety. Dungeons are a major part of Diablo 4, especially at the endgame. The current way of playing the game is endless runs of the same 40 or so nightmare dungeons. However, these dungeons are almost all the same. Let me describe a particular dungeon, and then you tell me down in the comments of which one that I'm thinking about. First, you enter the dungeon and there's a safe zone to prevent you from getting killed on the loading screen. Second, your first objective is to return 2 things to a pedestal. Third, after you go to another zone, your objective changes to slay all enemies. Fourth, the boss is the Blood Bishop. Fifth, the enemies in the dungeon include zombies and vampires. I'll let you know in the description right below the like button which dungeon I'm describing. Of course, I could be describing one of about 10 different dungeons in the game. This is because instead of having a wide variety of objectives and bosses, we see the same objectives over and over again, copy and pasted between all of the dungeons. Here's a complete list of all the objectives that I know about off the top of my head. Return the thing to the pedestal, slay all the enemies, free the prisoners, destroy the structures, slay the elites again, but this time they have 3 animus things that you have to pick up, and activate the levers. Now, out of all of these, the best objectives and the best dungeons are typically those that just have you kill an elite monster. And the reason is quite simple. Elite monsters themselves have lots of variety with different affixes, and they're also a minor challenge to take down compared to left-clicking and waiting 3 seconds for a prisoner to get freed. They can also spawn in a variety of locations, and they reward you with loot and XP. This keeps things very fresh. It's not a surprise at all then that some of players' favorite dungeons are typically those with the collect animus from animus carriers objectives, slay the elite, or destroy the structure objectives, especially when those elite monsters or structures spawn in a variety of locations and have a variety of affixes and also don't involve backtracking. I think increasing the number and variety of objectives can help dungeons feel more unique, but more important than that actually is the particular objective design. Adding a new objective where you just left-click something on the ground and wait is not the right path forward. Instead, tapping into the mechanics that then themselves offer variety, like affixes on elite monsters, is the way to bring freshness to dungeon objective design. Path of Exile has an interesting perspective here in that dungeons a lot of times offer random nodes around them that give crafting and loot opportunities that then have consequences for spawning monsters. These also often have tie-ins with Path of Exile's super endgame mechanics like Heist, Delirium, or Delve, and offer the player a small opportunity to progress their character and their loot alongside an alternate endgame progression route besides just getting more XP. Putting something like this into Diablo 4 over time will have the effect of giving players opportunities to stop and pay attention to certain mechanics that they like, or ignore ones that they deem slow or bad for their personal progression, and lead to more exciting moments and fresh variety of gameplay. I think there's a strong opportunity here in the medium future of Diablo 4 to offer these PoE-style nodes as objectives in dungeons, so that instead of just left-clicking on the same 5 prisoners every time, that the players are offered variety within the objective itself. But objective variety is not the only problem with overall dungeon variety. While I think it's the biggest problem, dungeons also have a few other issues to address. First, backtracking, where players have to go back and forth over empty terrain to complete an objective. It's just dead time. There's nothing going on there. Number 2, a mostly linear-only design that feels like a hallway that you're running down that only offers one way through a dungeon. Number 3, lack of player interactable mechanics. Things like watchtowers, tall grass, high ground that other games have implemented so that players can get their own strategic advantage. Most things in dungeons are designed to punish the player for standing in the wrong spot, instead of offering the player a way to really interact with the dungeon and give a strategic advantage for very smart players. As a result of all these problems, I think that dungeons have this sort of flat feeling to them right now. You find the objective, you slam dunk it, and then your build mostly determines the speed at which you can fly through the dungeon. There's little to do with interacting with the dungeon itself, and the dungeon tile set is mostly there to just look pretty while you do the same mechanics for the same copy-pasted designs over and over again. I hope in the future that we can see dungeons that have more objective variety, and more variety in those objectives themselves, less backtracking, more multi-pronged layouts or wide layouts as opposed to just linear hallways, and player interactable mechanics that can allow smart positioning and engagements to occur for the player. Our fourth and final problem with Diablo 4 is that there's no endgame to speak of. For anyone playing past level 70, it's abundantly clear that there really isn't much there beyond Nightmare Dungeons and Helltide. Nightmare Dungeons themselves are definitely an upgrade from the greater rifts that we had in Diablo 3, but they can also result in the same repetitive, grindy feeling that you might be used to from that game. The main issue here is that there's no paths for endgame progression. It'd be really awesome to have a super endgame boss that you need to progress to, and I'm not talking about Uber Lilith with her one-shot mechanics. I mean a progression of post-level 70 objectives beyond the season journey that you can complete to incrementally make your way to a boss that, with the right build, you could demolish. This is exactly what Path of Exile does, by the way, with different in-game bosses like Maven, for example, and the Atlas of Worlds. It's clear to me that Diablo 4 is trying to be Path of Exile in certain respects, and that's a good thing. I'd like to see sigils for Nightmare Dungeons involve more crafting than just getting random affixes. This feels very similar to mapping in PoE as well. If you haven't done mapping in PoE, by the way, let me explain. In PoE, you can actually enhance your maps so that they can drop more loot or have affixes that are beneficial to your playstyle. Maps, or in Diablo 4 parlance, sigils, can also drop at different rarities, just like loot can. This gives the player much more control over how they invest their approach to the endgame, and also how you invest your resources that you gain in doing the content that you want to do. In some extremely endgame cases, you can even prepare insanely juicy maps that net you endless packs of elite monsters and mountains of loot. It would be amazing if Diablo 4 could drop sigils of different rarities, allow you to craft them, and offer a progression system for the nightmare dungeons that these sigils unlock. Diablo 4 clearly has the capabilities of doing these things in a future with a deeper endgame, and juicing mechanics and endgame progression could eventually offer players a shot at things like the impossible to find Uber uniques, for example. I think that the major problem for endgame mechanics like this is that this is a ton of content for the dev team to develop and build on a game that's still fresh out of the gates and filled with lots of bugs and problems in the very core of the gameplay. And while I hope that we eventually get some great long-term endgame content, I also hope that the developers can solve crowd control, vulnerable damage, dungeon variety, and the large backlog of bugs first. Ultimately, I hope that this feedback can help focus Blizzard's direction of the game into the future. Thanks for watching. I've got lots of content coming for Season 1, including updates to my MAXROLL guides and video updates of those guides. If you want to see more Diablo 4 content, then please consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.